Most packs of orcs are led by a knob.
I'm so sorry.
Okay, here we go. Mose?
I was going to leave.
Yep, let's do the knob section.
We stand defiant. Cronus must not fall.
Hello, I'm Arbitor Ian. I talk about the lore of Warhammer on the internet, and today I'm back with IGN, and we're going to be talking about all the different factions you can play in the upcoming Dawn of War 4 game.
Only one thing is certain. War has returned to Cronus.
First up, the poster faction in every Dawn of War game, mostly so far, are the Blood Ravens chapter of Space Marines. If you played Space Marine 2 or Space Marine 1, you'll be familiar with what a Space Marine is. Space Marines are genetically enhanced warriors. They're all 8 foot tall, they wear tank armor and carry extremely destructive weapons, and they're spread across the Imperium of Man in various chapters, each of which is like honor-bound to defend an area of space or fight the enemies of the Imperium. Each chapter has its own sort of culture and history, usually based on where they're from. The Blood Ravens are quite an interesting one though. The Blood Ravens have been the protagonist chapter of all of the Dawn of War games. In fact, they were invented for the Dawn of War games. The Blood Ravens are a very mysterious chapter. They don't really know their origins. The history of Warhammer is thousands of years long, so that's not particularly unexpected. And one of the interesting things about them is that they venerate their librarians a lot. Librarians are battle psychers, like space wizards in Warhammer 40k. Every chapter has them, but they're usually confined to support roles. In the Blood Ravens, librarians are extremely prominent, which has led to a lot of problems over the years, but it means the chapter are able to fight in a very intelligent way. They're able to predict what their enemies are about to do or predict where flashpoints are going to happen and then react accordingly, which is useful because Space Marines are never that big of an army. One of the main strengths of Space Marines is the strength of the individual warrior. Each of them is wearing incredibly thick armor, they're armed with incredibly destructive weaponry, but there aren't that many of them. Each chapter is usually only about 1,000 Marines. So the ability the Blood Ravens have to pick and choose where they fight is a massive benefit. Another strength of the Blood Ravens chapter is all the weird relics they seem to have. This is a bit of a meme, but in some of the older games, all the different war gear and items you could collect through the game were famous items that existed in the Warhammer world, ones that the Blood Ravens really shouldn't have. So this joke came up that they all go around the galaxy stealing items from all the other chapters. Not sure if that'll continue to be the thing in Dawn of War 4, but I guess we're going to find out. So far, we've seen a bit of gameplay footage and a couple of trailers from the game, and we know that there are various specific units you're going to get in the game, so we'll go through a couple of key units from each of these factions and we can just explain what they are. It looks like the Blood Ravens are going to be led by some characters that had existed in some of the previous versions of the game. Cyrus is a captain of the Blood Ravens, but this time he's got a whole new suite of toys. Since the last Dawn of War game, all of the Space Marines have received some technological updates in the form of Primaris technology, and we can see that Cyrus here is now wearing Phobos armor, which is the sort of stealth and infiltration variant of Space Marine armor. He's accompanied by a librarian called Jonah, who was also in some of the previous games. Again, librarians, really, really important to the Blood Ravens. They're like advisors to their captains at best, and sometimes they even get to command whole task forces. So they'll both be back, but they're the commanders. The mainstay of all the Space Marine chapters in the first or second millennium, we're not sure, is intercessors. Intercessors are basic Space Marine warriors. They're armed in normal Mark 10 Tacticus power armor, and they carry bolt rifles. They can also sometimes be configured as assault intercessors, armed with bolt pistols and chainswords, and strapped to their backs is a jump pack, which you can see here allows them to make very large leaps. It's not quite flying, it's more like controlled falling, but yeah, that's what these guys are. Space Marine task forces are then routinely accompanied by a number of other units and warriors drawn from across the chapter, like specialist formations. The veterans of the first company are armed as Blade Guard. Blade Guard are veterans who specialize in dueling. They're armed with massive storm shields and iron halos on their back to project an energy field around them, and they're equipped with power weapons, which are weapons that have like a disruptor field on them to break through armor. Behind those, you can see some lumbering Redemptor dreadnoughts. Dreadnoughts are an interesting example of the grim darkness of 40k. A dreadnought is sort of a walking mech suit, but also life support machine for a grievously injured space marine. If a space marine is harmed in battle, but not quite killed, but definitely killed enough that he couldn't just walk around anymore, and he's a particularly honoured veteran or he did something particularly heroic, he might be entombed within the armoured shell of one of these. Most of his limbs are removed, if he still has them after that horrific injury. He's entombed in a sarcophagus full of amniotic fluid, and his senses are permanently connected to the walker suit's senses. This is an incredibly traumatic process. It's not fun in any way, and usually the dreadnought can't stay active for that long without suffering severe brain damage, but they're considered very holy relics within most Space Marine chapters. They're also very, very powerful. They can be equipped with lots of different weapons. Being in a dreadnought, it's not a nice existence. I mean, being a Space Marine isn't a particularly nice existence, but being in a dreadnought isn't particularly nice. They're mostly in pain all the time. They can't stay awake for very long, and obviously any damage that's inflicted to their armoured suits is transmitted through those sensors back to themselves. So yeah, not a nice experience, but one that's considered great and honourable within Space Marine chapters. We should also point out that these guys also exist. This is an Invicta tactical warsuit, which is like the robot bit of a dreadnought, but with a normal guy piloting it with like joysticks and things, walking around like he's an avatar or something. And finally, these guys have been a mainstay of Warhammer since the very first editions. These are Terminators. Terminators are also veteran warriors of the First Company, like the Blade Guard, but instead of being equipped with shields and swords, they're equipped in these relic suits of incredibly heavy Terminator armor. Terminator armor is a development of the sort of ancient exosuit people used to go into reactor cores. It's very, very heavy, with lots and lots of layers of armor on it, and Space Marines use it in close assault environments. They use it to clear infested space hulks or to assault enemy bastions. Most Space Marine chapters don't have many functioning suits of it. It's extremely old and takes a lot of resources to manufacture, so only the First Company, only veteran warriors are allowed to use it. Also, very relevant for the Dawn of War games, it's quite lumbering and definitely can't do backflips.
There's no time.
They'll kill you!
They can try.
Hello again. I'm back in my own studio for this bit because a new faction has been announced for Dawn of War 4. The Dark Angels are coming to the game, and they weren't announced when we recorded the other bit. So let's go into a bit about the Dark Angels and what sets them apart from a chapter like the Blood Ravens. The Dark Angels are one of the oldest chapters of Space Marines in the Imperium. In fact, they're so old that they go back all the way to the start of the Imperium, when they were one of the 20 legions of Space Marines that fought alongside the Emperor himself in the days of the Great Crusade. They've been active all across the Imperium for millennia, and because of that they have some unique ways of doing things. Back in the days of the Horus Heresy, while the Dark Angels were on the side of the Loyalists, some Dark Angels might not have agreed and rebelled against the Imperium, and at the end of the Heresy, those Dark Angels, known as the Fallen, went into hiding. The chapter of the 41st millennium have a couple of specialist detachments concerned with hunting down those fallen Dark Angels before anyone else finds out about them. The Raven Wing are the second company of the Dark Angels. They're configured as a reconnaissance and scouting detachment mounted on bikes and land speeders, and their job is to hunt for signs of the Fallen and locate them, and when they do locate them, they call in the heavy assault elements, the Deathwing, the first company of the Dark Angels. The Deathwing are the most elite of the Dark Angels, veteran warriors clad in bone white Terminator armor, often teleporting into battle as a rapid strike force. And the Dark Angels have operated in that way for millennia, but very recently something quite big has happened. The Dark Angels Primarch, Lion L. Johnson, returned to the Imperium after 10,000 years. He's one of only 2 Primarchs that the Imperium currently has active. The other one is Robute Gilliman. And he's found his chapter a little different to when he left them. They're a lot more paranoid to start with. Lion L. Johnson now leads the forces of the Dark Angels, and he's coming to the battlefields of Dawn of War 4. He's going to be a playable character. He carries the Lion Shield, which is a gift directly from the Emperor. And in the wider narrative of 40k, we're all waiting for the day when him and Gilliman finally meet up. It's not likely to happen in the narrative of Dawn of War 4, but you never know. And we're yet to see how much the presence of Lion L. Johnson on the battlefield will affect how the Dark Angels fight. Back in the days of the Great Crusade, when all the Primarchs led their legions around the galaxy, the Primarchs were these anchors, these inspirational heroes that the whole army rallied around and fought fought harder in their presence. So we'll see if that sort of mechanic comes to the battlefields of Dawn of War. Anyway, the Force of the Dark Angels are going to be a really interesting counterpart to the Blood Ravens in this. They're another chapter of Space Marines, so on the surface, a lot of the unit types are going to be quite similar, but they have a very different way of doing things and a very different feel. So it's going to be interesting to see how that translates to the game.
Our future is untold.
But enough about Space Marines. Dawn of War 4 features the Adeptus Mechanicus.
Mechanicus priests pursue knowledge long forgotten. Ancient horrors awaken, claiming dominion over all.
In the world of 40k, most people don't know the deeper secrets of how complex technology functions. There's not such a thing as scientific research practiced by normal people. Instead, the Adeptus Mechanicus have a hold on all advanced technology in the Imperium, partly so they can protect it from going too wrong. And of course, over the years, this has turned into an extremely dogmatic religion that worships something called the Machine God, which they see as spirit of knowledge. In their worldview, all knowledge already exists, and their role is merely to rediscover it. Creating new knowledge is heresy, and certainly adapting any sort of alien technology would also be heresy. The Adeptus Mechanicus exists as sort of a sister empire to the Imperium. They're slightly separated from it. They have their own forge worlds, their own explorator fleets, and their own armies, which are, as you might expect, full of cyborgs and weird scuttling machines, many of which are things they don't even really know how to maintain anymore. In many games, this means that their technology on the battlefield is really, really powerful. They have all these weird, crazy, arcane devices to kill their enemies with. But on the other hand, they're often like playing an undead army in other games. Their armies are full of hordes of these thralls and cyborgs with limited ability to think for themselves, all controlled by one tech priest at the very, very top. One of the big rules of the Adeptus Mechanicus is that actual artificial intelligence is, of course, completely banned. So all of their technology usually revolves around taking a human and modifying them to act in a certain way. At one extreme, they just become mindless robots. At the other extreme, they're humans with maybe a bit more limited ability to defy their boss's orders. That means that on the battlefield, what you tend to find is the Adeptus Mechanicus have hordes of troops and amazing contraptions and technology, but they're all following the directives of one singular tech priest, the person who owns the forge and probably made all of these guys. We can see a tech priest here. Tech priest is like a catch-all term. There's actually loads of different specialisms and ranks, as you might expect. On the battlefield, tech priests tend to be a bit of a wild card. Their own scientific investigations might have led them to develop almost anything. They've probably augmented their bodies however they wanted to. So a tech priest could be armed with kind of anything and could have a range of different abilities. The Mechanicus is a huge organisation, so it also includes lots of different sub-cults that worship very specific niche variants of the Machine God. These guys are electro-priests who worship the motive force, which is kind of like life energy or electricity or the idea of the will to do something. Electro-priests are covered in what's called electus, electric tattoos, that conduct various electrical energies around their body, and then they can use that energy to blast people on the battlefield or power up specific weapons.
In the Omnissiah's name!
The regular forces of the Mechanicus are usually called Skitarii. These are cyborgs, essentially, soldiers who have been cybernetically enhanced. We're seeing here some Sikaran Rust Stalkers, which are a development of regular Skitarii, given bionics to make them very fast and very adept in melee combat. You can see their legs here have been completely replaced by bionic versions. This is a common Skitarii thing to some degree, because the Skitarii originated as people who guarded merchant convoys across the plains of Forge Worlds, so they all got their legs replaced for that. And we can also see here an Iron Strider Ballistarius. Iron Striders are weird things. They're kind of perpetual motion walking machines that will continue walking forever until they're stopped. So everyone's really worried about stopping them. When they're put away after a battle, they're put on like walking platforms where they can always keep walking because no one wants to have to get them started again if they ever stop. There's a few different sorts of Iron Strider. This one, the Ballistarius variant, is the one armed with guns, but there are a couple of different similar things out there. And then finally, the Adeptus Mechanicus are accompanied into battle by this Knight Castellan. So knights are giant walking mech suits, piloted this time by a living person who sits in sort of a cybernetic throne at the center of it and can get out, unlike a dreadnought. Knights were developed way before the Imperium. They were one of humanity's first tools for colonizing the galaxy in the way back when days. And many knight worlds exist across the Imperium, each of which has become its own little feudal empire where the nobility ride around in these great big suits. That's why they're called knights. However, as ancient technology of humanity, the Adeptus Mechanicus also manufacture their own knight houses. Knight Castellans are a particularly heavily armoured variant of the knight chassis. There are lots of different knights out there. This one's armed with a plasma decimator and a volcano lance, which is a massive anti-tank weapon. So those are the forces of the Imperium and their robot friends. Now let's have a look at the Xenos forces opposing them. First up, we have the other sort of robot army, the Necrons.
Ancient horrors awaken, claiming dominion over all.
As we've mentioned, 40k is set thousands of years in the future, but the Necrons originated millions of years ago. They were a species called the Necrontyr. And the Necrontyr didn't have a very good time of it. They had a sun that gave out radiation that kept their lives really short. They all died of various diseases because of that. Horrible existence. They met a different alien species called the Old Ones, who for the purposes of this video are magic space frogs. Unlike the Necrons, the magic space frogs lived for thousands and thousands of years and had incredible mastery of the warp and amazing psychic powers, and the Necrontyr really didn't like this, so they ended up having a massive war. And one of the things that happened in this war is that the Necrons woke up some, let's call them star vampires, really, really powerful real-world entities to help them, and one of those entities tricked the Necrons, convincing the Necrons that they'd be way stronger and way better at winning this war if they'd just give up their souls and instead transfer themselves into living metal bodies. Of course, what actually happened is the vast majority of the Necrontyr species just became mindless automatons, ruled over by incredibly powerful lords in much better bodies. They didn't like this, so they turned on the star vampires and mostly killed them. But the upgrade worked. They ended up sort of winning the war. The problem was that war was so destructive that almost all life in the galaxy had been extinguished, and so the Necrons decided they'd go to sleep for a while until the galaxy sort of got back to normal. And in 40k, they're waking up. So, across the 40k galaxy, various planets have suddenly found giant black pyramids rising from the ground, out of which march legions of undead skeleton robots, all intent on purging the galaxy free of life once more, which is obviously a problem. And even their most basic warriors are very, very hard to kill. Their programming includes something called reanimation protocols that rebind the living metal of the warrior back together once it's down, and then it just gets back up again. In fact, you can spot the influence here by looking at old versions of the game where this rule was called "I'll be back."
I'll be back.
Of course, like all things in 40k, this whole mass waking of a legion of cybernetic robots has not gone particularly well. Turns out, if a robot gets put to sleep for 65 million years, the programming might degrade a bit, so frequently these Necrons are waking up and finding out that the lords who are controlling them are insane now, because their programming deteriorated so much while they were asleep. The mainstay of Necron armies is Necron warriors. This is what happened to an awful lot of the regular Necrontyr back in the day. Necron warriors have incredibly durable bodies, and they use Gauss Flayer weaponry, which is weaponry that when it hits someone, atomizes them layer by layer into a skeleton and then into nothing. These guys with the three big legs are Scorpek destroyers. Destroyers are one of the ways in which this programming degradation and madness have affected the Necrons. Some Necrons wake up with the undeniable urge to just exterminate all life in the galaxy down to the bacterial level. Those are called destroyers. They then modify their robot bodies into all sorts of forms that would be better for doing that. Generally, either flying platforms with massively heavy guns on them, or spider-like chassis with massive energized axe blades to do it much closer up. And then finally, we can see here a bit of a centerpiece of the Necron army since they were very first introduced, a Necron monolith. In theory, this is sort of a battle tank stroke transport vehicle, but no one's inside it. Instead, monoliths are basically moving portals. On the front of a monolith is a portal from which Necrons in reserve can walk out. And of course, they're covered by all this Gauss weaponry from the edges of the monolith. An awful lot of Necron vehicles and constructions are some variant of this. Giant pylons that rise from the ground, or massive floating building-like constructions made of this substance called noctilith. Noctilith is a material that's very resistant to psychic assault, which, if you remember, was really, really useful for the old Necrons here, since they were in a war with those magic space frogs. And if for some reason you want to play Dawn of War 4 and not play robots, there's at least one slightly more biological Xenos race. The Orks are back. The Orks have been in almost, I think, every Dawn of War game so far. They're one of the main antagonists in Warhammer 40k, and they tie into the whole Necron story in a bit of an interesting way. The Orks are like a biological weapon someone let loose on the galaxy. They were made by those old ones in order to help them when fighting against the ancient Necrons. Orks are giant, terrifying, green-skinned creatures who live only for war. In fact, they really, really like fighting, and that dominates their entire culture. Orks like nothing more than getting into a massive scrap. In fact, the more fighting an Ork does, the bigger the Ork gets, and the more respect he gets from all the other Orks. As we said, they were originally built as a sort of weapon to fight for the old ones, but the old ones are long gone now, and since then the Orks have become something of a problem for everyone in the galaxy. Orks reproduce by giving off spores that turn into sort of mushrooms that turn into sort of little Orks that then turn into big Orks, and that can happen on any planet Orks have ever been on, which makes them this constant problem that just pops up on its own and suddenly explodes into a mass of greenskins trying to fight anyone who looks at them. One of the interesting things about the Orks is that a lot of the knowledge that they would need to develop to, say, get off planet and become an interplanetary threat is woven into their DNA. Once enough Orks are around, Orks start popping up who just understand how to build tanks and guns and spaceships, understand how to teleport people from one place to the other, and the bigger the Ork infestation gets, the more of these sort of Orks pop up. So an Ork infestation that started with a few feral Orks just wandering around somewhere in a wasteland can end up pretty quickly turning into an interplanetary army flying around and invading new planets just for the fun of it. When this happens, it's called a war, or a war, or maybe a wah. No one's ever completely sure. And these wars, led by massive Ork war bosses, can become a real problem, wiping out whole swathes of the galaxy. The real genius of the Orks is their adaptability. They're incredibly tough, they don't need much resources to become a threat, and they're also very good at cannibalizing bits from whatever they find and turning it into more weapons and vehicles. They're really, really adaptable without needing a big industrial base to keep functioning. On the other hand, they enjoy fighting so much they'll keep doing it even amongst themselves if there's no one around. So any Ork war that loses its leaders tends to then fracture into lots of smaller competing warbands who are perfectly happy to have a fight against each other. That's still fun. Regular Orks are called boys or occasionally lads. For some reason, Orks, just like in Lord of the Rings, speak with Cockney accents. Ork boys are armed with simple weapons. Sluggers and shooters is a generic name for whatever gun they've built. And choppers, a standard name for anything with a blade on it. And Ork boys gather in huge packs and then run forward against the enemy. As long as they're in a fight, they're happy. They might choose to get into that fight a number of different ways. Beast Snagger boys are boys who really like taming great big scary animals because it's fun to let those loose on your enemies, and occasionally they'll try and ride them into battle, which may or may not go well for the boy in question. As you might expect, Orks are very cavalier with their own safety, and so Storm boys are Orks who have strapped giant rocket packs to their own backs to better fling them into the enemy and so they can get into a scrap faster. Given how Ork technology works, there's always one or two who go spiraling off into the distance somewhere, but most of them usually manage to get where they were aiming for. Another expression of Ork technology is in the armor they're wearing. Most Orks don't bother with a lot of armor, but as the Ork gets higher up the pole, beats up his mates a bit more and rises into command, they become something called nobs, which is short for nobles. Most packs of Orks are led by one or two nobs, and war bosses, the leaders of Orks, have a whole group of nobs around them, their mates that are sort of like a bodyguard. Nobs, of course, can get the good armor. And as that armor gets heavier and heavier and heavier, it turns into something called mega armor. Mega armor is kind of the Ork equivalent to Terminator armor. Hugely thick plates of whatever metal they could find, powered by an exoskeletal frame. And the few knobs who have been brutal, intimidating, or lucky enough to get their hands on some mega armor are of course called mega knobs. That's all the knobs. That's all the knobs. I think we've done all the knobs now.
No more knobs.
We got as far as mega knobs and we were good.
I'm so sorry.
Now you're gonna die!
Ork mech boys are also inspired by the weird technologies they see other species using. And so, of course, seeing what Space Marines have done, they've built their own dreadnoughts. Ork dreads are called Death Dreads. They're big, clanking armoured suits with as many arms as they can graft on, piloted by a boy who is cybernetically wired into the suit. Orks are very resilient to physical damage, so obviously, although this is a very painful procedure, the prospect of being able to wade through loads of enemies, causing loads of carnage, means that Orks are way more up for this than most other species are. Orks also construct even bigger walking or maybe waddling war machines. Usually at a certain point, these become known as idols to their two orky gods. Gork, who's cunningly brutal, and Mork, who's brutally cunning. One example of this is the Gorkanaut. Gorkanauts are massive walkers dedicated to the god Gork, and armed with colossal mega shooters and massive power claws. They're used as line breakers by the Orks. Often they're piloted by an Ork boy who was so enthusiastic that he probably shot a lot of his mates. They were like, yeah, let's just put him in that giant robot and shove him directly towards the enemy lines. Once they've broken through the lines, the big belly of the Gorkanaut then opens and disgorges even more Ork boys into the enemy.
For the Emperor!
As you can tell, the Orks have their own unique way of looking at the world of 40k. But that's all the factions that you're going to be able to play in Dawn of War 4, and maybe a little introduction to some of the things you're going to be able to use in Dawn of War 4. My name's Ian. As I said, I talk about Warhammer a lot online. In fact, I've done some other videos for IGN on similar subjects, so you can find them, probably linked below. And of course, I have my own channel, so go to that and watch more videos about knobs.